My family cut me out of the will while I was in a coma, so I evicted them all. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. You look like you've seen a ghost. Actually, I'm just your eviction notice. The music, a heavy string quartet playing from the corner of the grand foyer, stopped abruptly. The cellist's bow froze midair. 50 guests, dressed in black tie evening wear, turned their heads toward the front double doors. I stood on the threshold of my grandfather's historic estate. I wore a tailored charcoal suit over a reinforced back brace. My right hand gripped a thick, manila envelope stamped with the bright blue seal of the county court. 2 uniformed police officers stood precisely 3 feet behind my shoulders, their hands resting on their utility belts. Across the room, my father, Thomas, stood frozen on the landing of the sweeping mahogany staircase. A crystal champagne flute slipped from his fingers. It hit the imported hardwood floor, shattering into dozens of glittering shards. The champagne splashed across the polished wood, pooling around his leather dress shoes. Beside him, my sister, Chloe, dropped her phone. It clattered down 3 steps. Neither of them moved. They stared at me. My chest rose and fell with steady, even breaths. I did not blink. I stepped over the threshold, my cane tapping against the floorboards. "Turn the music off," I said, my voice cutting through the dead silence of the room. The string quartet immediately lowered their instruments. I walked toward the staircase, keeping my eyes locked entirely on Thomas's pale, sweating face. This was my house. I held the legal documents proving it. My father swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply. He gripped the wooden banister so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. For 6 months, he had occupied this estate, operating under the assumption that the dirt was already thrown over my coffin. He was wrong. The papers in my hand carried the weight of a judge's signature, terminating his illusion. I stopped at the base of the stairs, extending the envelope upward. The blue ink of the court stamp caught the light from the massive crystal chandelier hanging directly above us. The seal clearly read, "Immediate order of eviction and injunction." I tapped the rubber tip of my aluminum cane against the bottom step, the sound echoing sharply against the high plaster ceiling. Guests backed away, clearing a wide circle around the staircase. The officers stepped into the room, boots heavy on the wood. The document in my hand was going to systematically dismantle their entire stolen life. For years prior, my grandfather sat behind his massive oak desk in the estate's library. The room smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco. He pushed a heavy, leather-bound folder across the polished wood surface toward me. Inside was the original deed to the property, signed and notarized, transferring full ownership of the 10,000-square-foot historic home into my name. Thomas and Chloe sat on the leather sofa opposite the desk. Thomas stood up so quickly his knees knocked the heavy coffee table, sending a porcelain ashtray sliding across the glass. "You cannot do this, Dad," Thomas said, his voice loud, his face flushing dark red. He pointed a finger at the folder. "I am your son. That property belongs to me by right." My grandfather did not raise his voice. He folded his hands on the desk. "The deed is filed, Thomas. Marcus takes over immediately." Chloe crossed her arms tightly across her chest. Her jaw clenched. "This is a joke. He's 30 years old. He doesn't know how to run this place." She stood up, grabbed her designer purse, and marched toward the heavy library doors. She pulled the brass handle and slammed the door shut behind her, rattling the framed maps hanging on the adjacent wall. Thomas leaned over the desk, planting both palms flat on the wood. He stared down at my grandfather, breathing heavily through his nose. "You will regret this," Thomas stated, his voice dropping to a low register. He turned on his heel and walked out, leaving the door wide open. I sat in the leather chair, looking down at the deed. My name, Marcus, was printed clearly on the top line. My grandfather poured a glass of water from a glass pitcher, took a slow sip, and set it down. He looked at me, his expression entirely neutral. He pointed at the safe in the corner of the room. "Keep the original locked up, Marcus," he instructed. I nodded, picked up the heavy folder, and walked over to the steel safe. I dialed the combination, placed the documents inside, and spun the dial to lock it. The heavy steel bolts engaged with a loud, mechanical click. I did not know that Thomas was standing in the hallway, watching me close the safe. He memorized the exact location of the documents that he would later manipulate and steal. Rain hammered against the windshield of my sedan. The wipers slapped rapidly back and forth, struggling to clear the heavy sheet of water. I drove down the interstate at exactly 55 miles per hour. The headlights illuminated the slick, reflective asphalt ahead. At 11:42 p.m., a commercial transport truck traveling in the opposite lane blew a front left tire. The massive vehicle swerved across the concrete median barrier. I slammed my foot on the brake pedal. The anti-lock brakes engaged, pulsing violently against my shoe. The tires screeched. The truck's steel grille impacted the driver's side of my sedan. The sound was a deafening crunch of crushing metal and shattering safety glass. The driver's side door caved inward, pinning my left leg against the center console. The airbags deployed with an explosive pop, filling the cabin with white smoke and the smell of burnt powder. My head struck the side pillar. The windshield cracked into a massive spiderweb pattern. Then, absolute blackness. For months later, my eyes opened. Bright, sterile fluorescent lights glared above me. A machine to my right emitted a steady, rhythmic beep. A thick plastic tube extended from my throat, pushing air into my lungs with a mechanical hiss. My arms lay flat against the white hospital sheets, completely immobilized by heavy casts. I blinked rapidly, adjusting to the harsh light. A nurse in blue scrubs walked into the room, checked the monitor, and stopped. She looked at my open eyes, dropped her clipboard on the linoleum floor, and ran into the hallway shouting for a doctor. I could not speak. I could not move my legs. I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the small perforations in the acoustic panels. A doctor rushed in, shining a bright pinlight into my pupils. "Marcus, you are in the intensive care unit," he said, speaking loudly. "You have been in a medically induced coma for 127 days. The machine continued its steady, mechanical pumping. I felt the vibration of the ventilator pushing rhythmically against my chest. I had absolutely no idea that my family had already orchestrated my financial execution. 2 weeks after the breathing tube was removed, the heavy wooden door to my hospital room swung open. Lawyer Vance walked in. He wore a gray suit, his silver hair neatly combed. He carried a thick leather briefcase. He pulled a plastic chair to the side of my bed and sat down. He did not smile. He opened the briefcase, pulled out a stack of stapled papers, and placed them flat on my tray table. "Marcus," Vance said, his tone entirely flat. "Look at the signature on page 4. I reached out with a trembling hand, my fingers stiff from months of disuse. I flipped the heavy pages. The document was titled Quitclaim Deed. It transferred full ownership of the historic estate from me to Thomas. Below the legal text was a signature line. The name Marcus was written in black ink, accompanied by a notary stamp dated 3 weeks after my car accident, a time when I was completely unconscious and relying on a ventilator to breathe. "That is not my signature," I said, my voice a harsh, raspy whisper. Vance nodded slowly. "I know. I checked the visitor logs. Thomas came to the ICU the day before this document was notarized. He brought a lawyer. They filed this deed with the county clerk." Vance pulled a second document from his briefcase. It was a bank statement. "Chloe has taken control of the estate's liquid trust." She presented a forged medical proxy to the bank. He pointed to a line item detailing a wire transfer of $50,000 to a luxury car dealership. "They assumed you would never wake up," Vance stated, leaning back in his chair. "They moved into the estate last month. They are currently remodeling the West Wing." I stared at the forged ink. My fingers gripped the edges of the paper, crinkling the corners. I looked up at Vance. "Does Thomas know I am awake?" Vance shook his head. "The hospital has strict confidentiality protocols. I am your listed emergency contact, not him." I placed the documents back on the table, aligning the edges perfectly. "Tell the doctors to keep my recovery entirely off the official public hospital records." For the next 6 months, I existed strictly inside the walls of the private rehabilitation center. Vance handled the transfer logistics, ensuring my admission was processed under a strict non-disclosure agreement. My family received 0 updates. I sat in a standard aluminum wheelchair, staring down at the parallel bars in the physical therapy gym. The rubber mat beneath the bars smelled strongly of industrial floor cleaner. A physical therapist, a tall man named David, stood beside me holding a heavy canvas gait belt. Stand, David instructed, his voice echoing in the empty room. I gripped the steel bars. The metal was cold against my palms. I pushed downward, locking my elbows. The muscles in my legs visibly trembled beneath my sweatpants. Pain shot up my spine, sharp and immediate. I locked my knees and stood upright. Sweat dripped down my forehead, stinging my eyes. Step, David said, keeping his hands hovering near the belt. I lifted my right foot, dragging the rubber sole of my shoe across the mat, and planted it forward. I repeated the motion with my left leg. Every single step required massive physical exertion. I spent 4 hours a day in that gym. I pulled heavy resistance bands until my shoulders burned. I lifted iron kettlebells until my hands formed thick calluses. In the evenings, I sat in my sterile room, eating unseasoned hospital food and staring at the digital clock on the wall. I did not watch television. I did not read books. I focused entirely on the mechanical repetition of physical movement. Vance visited every Friday at exactly 4 p.m. He brought printed updates on the estate, sliding the folders across the table. I read them while icing my knees with plastic bags filled with crushed ice. I watched my own handwriting slowly return to normal as I signed legal retainers for Vance to hire private investigators. I traced my signature over and over on legal pads, ensuring the stroke pressure matched my pre-accident baseline perfectly. I rebuilt my physical strength while my family rapidly burned through my stolen fortune. Vance arrived on a Tuesday afternoon holding a thick, expanding file folder. He dropped it onto the metal table in my room with a heavy thud. He unfastened the elastic band and spread bank statements, glossy photographs, and printed emails across the surface. The bleeding is accelerating, Vance reported, pointing a pen at a highlighted line on a Chase bank statement. Chloe purchased a 2025 Porsche 911. Paid in cash, $85,000, drawn directly from the estate's maintenance fund. I picked up an 8x10 photograph. It showed the main living room of the estate. The antique Persian rugs and original 19th century oil paintings were gone. In their place sat mirrored coffee tables, white leather sectionals, and neon wall art. Thomas used an auction house in the city to liquidate your grandfather's antique clock collection, Vance continued, sliding an auction receipt across the table. He netted $200,000. The funds were deposited into his personal offshore account 2 days later. I inspected the printed email. It was correspondence between Thomas and a landscaping firm, authorizing the complete removal of the historic rose garden to install a massive concrete pool deck. The invoice attached totaled $120,000. My jaw tightened. The muscles in my neck flexed. I stacked the bank statements, aligning the corners meticulously. They are acting fast, I said, handing the stack back to Vance. They want to convert the assets before any audits can flag the transfers. Vance pulled one final piece of paper from his pocket. It was a glossy invitation, printed with gold foil lettering. It read, Thomas and Chloe warmly invite you to the grand unveiling of the renovated estate. The date was set for exactly 3 weeks away. I stared at the gold lettering, tracing the embossed edge of the card with my thumb. The invitation provided a precise, hard deadline for us to strike. I told Vance to immediately finalize the contract with the forensic handwriting specialist. The forensic handwriting expert, Dr. Eris Thorne, met Vance and me in a secure conference room downtown. He placed a 50-page, spiral-bound technical report on the center of the oak table. He opened a laptop and connected it to the wall-mounted projector. An extremely high-resolution image of the forged quitclaim deed appeared on the screen, magnified by 400%. Notice the line quality, Dr. Thorne said, pointing a laser pointer at the M in Marcus. There are distinct microtremors and pen stops along the curve. A natural signature is fluid. This indicates a slow, deliberate tracing motion. He clicked a button. A second image appeared, an old birthday card I had signed for Thomas 5 years ago. He overlaid the forged signature directly on top of the birthday card signature. The lines matched flawlessly, stroke for stroke, right down to the millimeter. Nobody signs their name identically twice, Dr. Thorne explained, his tone clinical and detached. A perfect match is a guaranteed indicator of a tracing forgery. Furthermore, we analyzed the ink using a chemical solvent test. He flipped to page 12 of his heavy report. The notary stamp on the deed is dated October 14th. However, The specific gel ink used for the signature was not manufactured until December of that same year. It is a physical impossibility for that document to be authentic. I picked up the heavy report and flipped through the dense pages of graphs, chemical analysis, and magnified ink splatters. The evidence was absolute, concrete, and scientifically irrefutable. I looked across the table at Vance. He was already drafting a legal motion on his pad, his pen moving rapidly across the yellow paper. I closed the report and pushed it to the center of the table. "We have the weapon," I said, standing up from my chair without the use of my cane. The only remaining step was to deliver the fatal blow directly in front of a judge. 3 days before the scheduled party, I sat in the passenger seat of Vance's unmarked black sedan. We were parked tightly against the curb on the dark street directly opposite the estate's massive wrought iron gates. The engine was off. I held a pair of heavy military-grade binoculars to my eyes, adjusting the focus ring. The estate was brightly illuminated by newly installed exterior floodlights. A white catering van was backed up to the kitchen entrance. 4 men in uniform carried heavy wooden crates of champagne bottles up the stone steps. Chloe's bright yellow Porsche was parked illegally on the front lawn, the tires crushing the manicured grass my grandfather had meticulously maintained. Through the large bay windows of the dining room, I watched Thomas directing a team of decorators. He wore a tailored suit, pointing aggressively at a massive floral arrangement, dictating its exact placement. His face was flushed, his mouth moving rapidly as he barked orders at the staff. Chloe walked into the frame holding a tablet, laughing and tapping the screen. They were entirely comfortable. They exhibited no signs of anxiety, operating with the complete assurance that the property belonged to them. I lowered the binoculars, resting them heavily on the dashboard. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. It was 9:45 p.m. The physical reality of their theft was playing out exactly 50 yards in front of me. They had fundamentally altered the physical structure of my property, replacing historic architecture with cheap, gaudy displays of instant wealth. Vance rolled down his window, letting in the cool night air. He tapped his fingers against the leather steering wheel. I picked up the binoculars again and watched Thomas pour a glass of wine from a freshly opened bottle, taking a long, deeply satisfied sip. I memorized the exact layout of the security guard stationed near the front entrance. The following morning, Vance and I sat inside the heavy mahogany doors of Judge Eleanor Ross's private chambers. The air conditioning hummed loudly from the ceiling vent. Judge Ross, wearing her black judicial robes, sat behind a massive desk. She carefully adjusted her reading glasses and opened the 50-page forensic report provided by Dr. Thorne. The room was completely silent except for the crisp sound of heavy paper turning. Vance sat straight-backed in his chair, his hands folded neatly in his lap. I sat beside him, my posture rigid, my medical records stacked precisely in front of me. Judge Ross stopped on page 12, examining the chemical ink analysis. She looked up from the documents, her eyes locking onto mine. She then looked at the medical records proving I was comatose on the date the deed was supposedly signed. "This is a gross, calculated fraud," Judge Ross stated, her voice sharp and authoritative. She picked up a heavy black fountain pen. She pulled the emergency injunction order toward her. The document demanded the immediate invalidation of the forged quitclaim deed and granted a police-backed, immediate eviction of Thomas and Chloe from the premises. The metal nib of the pen scratched loudly against the thick legal paper as she signed her name on the bottom line. She stamped the document with the official, heavy blue county seal. She slid the paper across the desk toward Vance. "The forged deed is officially void," she declared. "The property legally remains in your name, Marcus. You have the full authorization of this court and the local sheriff's department to remove the trespassers immediately." I picked up the document. The blue ink was still slightly wet. I folded it precisely in half and placed it inside a thick manila envelope. I stood up, buttoned my suit jacket, and nodded to the judge. We walked out of the courthouse carrying the exact legal ammunition needed for the ambush. The bass from the massive sound system vibrated violently through the soles of my leather shoes as I walked up the long gravel driveway. It was 8:30 p.m. The grand unveiling gala was in full swing. Dozens of luxury cars were parked along the manicured lawns. A massive white event tent was erected in the side garden, glowing with purple LED uplighting. I wore a dark charcoal suit, moving with a steady, calculated gait. Two uniformed police officers walked silently beside me, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Vance walked slightly ahead, carrying his leather briefcase. We reached the main entrance. Two private security guards in black suits stood in front of the heavy double doors, holding digital tablets. One of them stepped forward, raising his hand flat to stop us. "Name on the guest list, please," the guard demanded, looking directly at my cane. I did not stop walking. I did not speak. The police officer to my right stepped sharply forward, pulling his official badge from his belt and holding it directly in the guard's face. "County Sheriff's Department." "Step aside immediately," the officer commanded, his voice projecting total authority. The guard's eyes widened. He lowered his hand and quickly stepped back, pressing his back flat against the brick wall. I reached out, gripped the heavy brass handle of the front door, and pushed it open. The noise of the party hit me like a physical wave: clinking glasses, loud laughter, and heavy music. The grand foyer was packed with people drinking expensive champagne and eating hors d'oeuvres off silver trays. I stepped onto the imported hardwood floor, gripping the manila envelope tightly in my right hand. The police officers flanked me, establishing a clear, intimidating perimeter inside the house. I looked through the crowded room and locked my eyes directly onto my father. Thomas stood confidently on the first landing of the sweeping mahogany staircase. He held a crystal champagne flute high in the air, using a silver spoon to clink against the glass. The sharp ringing sound cut through the chatter. The guests slowly stopped talking, turning their attention upward. Chloe stood 2 steps below him, wearing a heavily sequined designer gown, smiling broadly for a photographer's flashing camera. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate the rebirth of this historic property," Thomas announced, his voice booming across the foyer. I stepped fully into the bright light of the massive crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling. I did not say a word. I simply stood motionless in the center of the floor, staring directly up at him. The guest nearest to me turned, saw my face, and gasped loudly, physically stepping back and bumping into a waiter. The movement caused a domino effect. People turned, their eyes widening in absolute shock as they recognized the man they believed was lying permanently vegetative in a hospital bed. The silence spread rapidly through the room like a physical shockwave. Thomas looked down from the landing. His mouth stopped moving mid-sentence. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His fingers went entirely slack. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his hand. It plummeted downward, striking the imported hardwood floor and shattering into dozens of glittering shards. The champagne splashed violently across the polished wood, pooling around his leather dress shoes. Beside him, Chloe's jaw dropped completely open. She dropped her phone, the device clattering noisily down 3 wooden steps before coming to a halt. Neither of them moved a single muscle. They stared at me, physically paralyzed on the stairs. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Actually, I'm just your eviction notice." The string quartet in the corner abruptly stopped playing. The cellist's bow froze midair. I stepped forward, my cane tapping sharply against the floorboards. "Turn the music off completely," I instructed, my voice cutting through the dead air. The musicians immediately lowered their instruments and backed away. I walked toward the base of the staircase, stopping exactly 3 feet from the bottom step. Thomas gripped the wooden banister tightly, his knuckles turning stark white. He swallowed heavily. "Marcus," Thomas stammered, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of its previous booming authority. "How are you walking?" the doctor said. I did not let him finish the sentence. I pulled the court document from the manila envelope and held it up. "The doctors didn't say anything, Thomas, because I legally barred them from giving you any information." I unfolded the heavy paper. I looked at the crowd of 50 silent guests, then back to Thomas. "I have a court order signed by Judge Eleanor Ross," I stated loudly, projecting my voice so every person in the room could hear the exact legal terms. "This document physically invalidates the quitclaim deed you filed on October 14th. The forensic report proved you traced my signature using an ink that did not exist on the date you claimed it was signed." I stepped onto the first step, extending the document upward. "You forged a legal document while I was in a coma attached to a ventilator. You stole this estate." Thomas's chest heaved rapidly. He looked desperately at the surrounding crowd, shaking his head. "That is a lie," he shouted, though his voice wavered violently. "This is my house. You are trespassing." I turned slightly, signaling to the two police officers standing by the door. The officers stepped forward simultaneously, resting their hands firmly on their heavy-duty belts. Chloe broke the paralysis first. She lunged forward down the stairs, her high heels catching on the hem of her sequin gown. She stumbled, catching herself on the banister, and screamed at me. "You cannot do this. We spent $500,000 renovating this place," she shrieked, pointing an acrylic fingernail directly at my face. I did not flinch. I kept my posture entirely rigid. "You spent my money, Chloe," I corrected her, my tone flat and objective. "And you will be receiving a separate civil lawsuit from Lawyer Vance regarding the liquidation of the estate's liquid trust." Thomas lunged down the stairs, grabbing the court order from my hand. He ripped the heavy paper directly in half, his face flushing a dangerous, dark red. He threw the torn pieces onto the floor. "Get out of my house," he roared, veins bulging visibly on his neck. The leading police officer immediately unclipped his handcuffs, the metal clacking loudly in the quiet room. The officer stepped squarely in front of Thomas, physically blocking his path to me. "Sir, you just destroyed a copy of a binding court order," the officer stated, his voice calm but highly aggressive. "You have exactly 1 hour to pack your personal belongings and vacate this premises. If you refuse to leave, or if you cause any physical damage to this property, you will be placed under immediate arrest for criminal trespass." Thomas stared at the metal handcuffs dangling from the officer's hand. He looked at the torn paper on the floor, then at the guests who were actively whispering and recording the altercation on their smartphones. His shoulders physically slumped. The aggressive, domineering posture completely collapsed. He turned his back to me and slowly walked up the stairs. Chloe followed him up the staircase, violently sobbing into her hands as she walked. The guests did not wait for instructions. They shuffled rapidly toward the front doors, setting their champagne glasses down on any available flat surface. Engines roared to life in the driveway as luxury cars aggressively sped off the property, tires kicking up gravel. Within 15 minutes, the grand foyer was entirely empty, save for Vance, the police officers, and me. Heavy footsteps echoed from the second floor. Thomas and Chloe dragged 3 large, hardshell suitcases down the mahogany staircase. Chloe's face was streaked with running mascara. She carried a stack of designer shoe boxes stacked precariously under her chin. Thomas dragged his luggage, not looking in my direction. He walked straight toward the front double doors. The police officers stood by the exit, closely monitoring their physical movements to ensure they did not take any fixtures or artwork. They reached the threshold. Chloe stopped and turned around, dropping one of the shoe boxes onto the floor. "You are completely dead to us," she hissed, her voice shaking with absolute rage. I did not respond. I watched the officer pick up the shoe box and hand it back to her. Thomas pushed past her, dragging his suitcase over the stone threshold and out into the cool night air. The wheels of the luggage clattered loudly against the concrete walkway. Chloe followed him, the sequins of her dress catching the exterior floodlights. I stepped forward, grabbed the heavy brass handle, and physically pulled the massive door shut. The heavy latch engaged with a loud, metallic click. I turned the deadbolt, sliding the thick steel bar firmly into the doorframe. The police officers nodded, turned around, and walked toward their cruiser parked in the driveway. The massive historic estate was finally empty, and the silence was heavy and absolute. I walked slowly through the quiet rooms of the first floor. The space was completely trashed. Empty glasses, crumpled napkins, and half-eaten plates of food littered the mirrored coffee tables. I picked up a piece of cheap neon wall art Chloe had hung in the dining room, pulled it off the wall, and dropped it directly into a heavy black trash bag. I spent the entire next week systematically erasing their physical presence from the house. I hired a commercial dumpster company to park a roll-off container in the driveway. I ordered contractors to tear out the white leather sectionals and smash the mirrored tables, tossing the debris into the metal bin. Vance filed the massive civil lawsuit against them 2 days later, officially freezing all of their remaining bank accounts and placing liens on their vehicles to recoup the stolen funds. They were completely financially crippled, relying on cheap rental apartments across the city. The physical reality of family betrayal is entirely logistical. Blood does not prevent forgery, and shared DNA does not stop greed when large sums of money are left unprotected. My grandfather trusted a basic paper deed, and that vulnerability nearly cost me the entire estate. My concrete advice is strictly structural. Establish an irrevocable ironclad trust. Assign multiple, independent legal fiduciaries who have no biological connection to your family. Install heavily monitored medical proxies that explicitly require multiple layers of verification before any financial power can be legally transferred. Do not rely on loyalty when dealing with valuable assets. Rely exclusively on tight legal contracts and unforgiving security protocols. Protect your property with the exact same ruthless precision that opportunistic people will absolutely use to try and take it from you.